Hello and welcome to episode number 9 of the Crisis Intelligence Podcast. Today is Sunday, August 3rd, 2014. I'm Melissa Agnes, and this podcast is brought to you by Agnes Day. Let's talk crisis intelligence. Hey Mike, thanks so much for taking the time to chat with me here today. So why don't you introduce yourself and tell us about what you do?
Yeah, hi Melissa. Good to be here and speak with everyone today. I train, I consult, and I speak on primarily incident command, incident management, crisis response, and emergency evacuation.
Excellent. And what are the types of organizations that you typically work with, Mike?
Two kinds. So first, in the public sector would be government agencies, all the way from federal government all the way down to a local municipality. They're just trying to kind of sharpen the axe, if you will, on how to respond a little bit better than they currently do to floods and disasters, tornadoes, other types of natural events. And then on the private side, a lot of incident management for everything from nonprofits, school districts, up to kind of mid-sized organizations, really just trying to get their response plans just a little more refined, so that when something big, bad, and ugly does happen, they're in a little bit better shape to respond to it effectively.
Excellent. And what are some of the gaps? I mean, we know that our listeners are ranged between everything, your two audiences that you just listed. So what are some gaps, looking at both, that you see most commonly today in terms of planning and preparation and really being ready?
Actually, Melissa, that's a good question. It's quite simply the refinement of clear and communicated objectives. A lot of times we give that lip service, and we write objectives in a very kind of grand and vague kind of way. But when the defecation hits the oscillation, if you know what I'm saying, those objectives really should be the touchstone on what happens next in order to get through an interruption or disruption to the other side. So it's really that lack of clarity on the front end and the lack of implementation on the back end to clearly identified and communicated objectives, I think, is the biggest friction point I see. And that's both public sector and private sector.
And that, in my experience, runs very common with the things that I see on the communication side of crisis management. It's like organizations, everything seems really great when it's on paper. And when you start testing it, you kind of realize that, oh, okay, there was a huge disconnect here. And that resulted in, for example, I do a lot of crisis simulations. And just last week, I was doing one with an organization. We realized that what the media team, so that involved the social media team, that involved the traditional media team, and a few other components, and what was happening in the command center with the leaders within the crisis, there was a huge gap there. And yet the plan, by looking at the plan, you would have thought that communication plan was excellent internally, that there would have not been that gap. And right. That gap resulted in them not managing the simulated crisis as effectively as I would have thought prior, like knowing the organization, but also in terms of managing their own reputation. So, yeah,
I'm
go
guessing
ahead.
It's probably a good plan based on the fact that it was printed on glossy paper and put in a nice binder, right?
Well, actually, this company in particular, normally, yes. This company in particular is really, really great at, in my opinion, they put their plan to test every year with really big simulations. And so they're really good. They really get it. They need to for the type of organization that they are. But they had never tested the reputational side of it. So they had always tested the procedural side. And we realized things like, for example, their command center, the room that they were really the hub for the crisis management, team was too small physically. So that for them was giving them a psychological block of not calling in the necessary people that they needed to communicate with. Instead of picking up the phone, it would have been more effective to call them into the room, and they weren't, because they realized the room physically was too small, and it was a psychological block for them. So it's really interesting the things that you see when you go through the testing parts or phases of a plan.
Melissa, when you do those evaluations, do you feel like your clients are expecting a high level of resolution, meaning like 100% solution, even in training? I've noticed that a lot of companies are they're enterprise level, so they're trying to go and make a living, and they're trying to provide shareholder value, et cetera. And in doing so, they're not really allowed to perform at less than 100%. At least I think that's what their belief is. So so that's their culture. And so when you put them into a training environment, if they're not used to training, have you noticed that they are not willing to make mistakes in training, or that they don't deal well with them because they're not used to making mistakes and learning from them? Have you noticed that?
In my experience, it really depends on the team. However, my approach to these types of exercises, both prior to initiating the exercise in the day of, during, and after the exercise, when you go through the debriefing with the team, is that this is a test. And it's not a test to test your capabilities. It's a test to strengthen, to give you experience, to strengthen your capabilities, work together, but to test your plan. So then it doesn't really fall on the role of a particular person, or I find that that helps in not getting the defensive responses. Instead of, for example, the disconnect that I just talked about in one particular exercise, there was one person in particular that people thought that I was going to single out because it was him. The broken telephone was him. However, that's not his fault. If the broken telephone is him, there's something wrong with the plan, because he might leave the role and somebody else will take this role in the future, might be great at it. But then again, somebody again after that might take the role and still have the same issue and disconnect, because I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but it's the plan that needed fixing, not the person.
Right.
If that made any sense.
It makes perfect sense. Functional roles versus person-related roles, and it's one of the hallmarks of speaking to the public sector side for a moment. The vernacular is primarily based, or has its origins in a system called ICS, or Incident Command System. Origins back in World War II, all the way up to the fire service in the early 70s. And then now it's being pushed out not only to virtually every city, municipality, state, regional, tribal, federal government, but as well as some of the private sector. And so one of my areas of practice is that translation from the very government-centric, acronym-centric system, and to try to translate it into a language that a lot of the private sector can understand. And one of the hallmarks of the ICS system is that very thing you just spoke about, and that is the functional-based training, testing, operating, versus the person-based training. The common example would be when we default a lot of times to the top of the organization, whereas that may not be the best person that runs that particular job. It may be that in the case of an evacuation, let's say, we refer to floor wardens. It's very common in the evacuation business. So a floor warden on a multi-story building may be attached to Johnny, who's the floor warden that day. But if Johnny's on vacation, if there's not a well thought out plan, like you just spoke about, balancing that functional need versus the person, when Johnny's in Aruba on vacation and everyone has to evacuate, people will lose their mind not knowing what to do unless that floor warden role becomes institutionalized as a function with multiple people trained for it, so that whoever puts on that vest or the shiny helmet or whatever, or announces that they're the floor warden, that everyone does what they're trained to do. So it's a gap that is less common, I think, in the public sector, but certainly prevalent, as you just pointed out, in the private sector as well.
And how do you find, I have clients in energy, particularly for the purpose of this conversation. And I find that, they're trained in ICS, the majority of them, the ones who've been around in the organization longer. And yet they take that and they take the structure of ICS and they do it in a less strict way so that they have, the structure there, but not the formality? Do you find that you see that as well, where organizations are now kind of combining that method of, crisis and management with their own simulation or modification that to fit their corporate culture?
That's a great topic, Melissa. Yes, and sometimes it's because I force it that way, and sometimes it's because they prefer it that way. But in either case, there are modifications that companies are making. And here's that fine line that I would say someone before they really go off the reservation with that ICS, one of the other hallmarks is the common language. And the purpose being is that when something really big, really bad, really ugly occurs, you're wanting to get a lot of people that don't really know very much about each other in the same place, making unified decisions using the same language. And the less friction in that area, obviously, the better the outcome is going to be. So when you start departing from those hallmarks, then you start diluting some of the efficacy of that program. So as long as they're well informed about it, government agencies that I work with, they don't really have a choice. They have to meet certain requirements in order to receive grant money and that sort of thing. So they don't really have the option to modify the program. However, the private sector, and I've got one client now, and we have made some. For the last 3 years, I worked with them, and there have been some pretty grand departures from the nomenclature that ICS is very heavy in. They're not trying to meet a standard. They're not trying to do anything other than just build capability so that they can manage their own response. Nothing wrong with that whatsoever.
Absolutely. It's really important for organizations who know that, for example, educational institutions, energy, organizations that are more the private sector, but know that in an emergency, in different types of emergencies, they are going to need to cooperate with, different government agencies. And to exactly the point that you just said, you don't know, you need to make sure that the lines of communication are consistent and easily interpreted and understood.
One of the simple examples to that comes up frequently is in ICS. The person in charge or responsible for the incident at the beginning and at the end is titled the incident commander, and that incident commander handles every functional responsibility up until the time that they delegate and defer out. A lot of organizations, they don't like that word. Incident commander is too heavy-handed. It implies too much. It just implies a lot of the wrong things. So, for example, one of the sports leagues I work with that hosts large sports tournaments over large areas, very well known in the area where they operate. And when I brought up the specter of the organizational chart and incident commander, they said, no, that's not going to happen. What they were used to using, however, was tournament director. So I said, well, what would happen if a chlorine truck that was upwind had a breach in it and filled your fields full of chlorine gas, and it was a very large response, multiple casualties, and the fire department showed up? Would they know to interface with the tournament director as the equivalent as the incident commander? And I think most people would say yes. People would, common sense would dictate that yes, the tournament director would be the same as the incident commander. So in that case, you just sprinkle in a little common sense and you're off to the races. And that would be a simple modification that I find that I use probably more often than not. Whereas people don't like the government-centric
terminology.
The same thing, exactly.
Well, it's important. I would see that in terms of making sure that that's part of the plan, so that if that person within that role who understands that, okay, yes, we call my role this, but other organizations that we might have to work with would refer to me in my role as this, title. So I need to know the difference. That would be something very, very important to practice with each exercise, yearly or bi-yearly, depending on the organization, depending on how often they simulate crises and exercise the plan, so that it doesn't get lost in translation or lost in time.
Right. One of the ways that we kind of force that, the exercises that I do are they're very scripted because they're trying to meet a federal standard. But we will literally take someone out of play. The exercises, in my view, are are training. They're not really intended to have gotchas. So we will kind of manufacture a training point so people don't lose their mind when we take Johnny out of the exercise, so that they understand that Johnny may not be available. And a lot of times, like you mentioned early on, which I think is really important to restate, and that is that if all we do are write plans, and if all we do is put them up on the shelf and display them, then we're really missing what I consider to be one of the most functional, important parts of any type of crisis response, and that is exercising that plan, because that's really where you see those friction points. That's when you find out that the room isn't big enough, that the water that doesn't refill the toilets where you're planning on the operation center, and all the other little things that could really bring things to a grinding halt. So that exercise is, I would rather have an exercise that's coachable than having a $10,000 plan sitting on the shelf. I think the exercise will prove more reliable when it comes to something bad happening.
Oh, I agree with you wholeheartedly. And a big trend that I'm seeing now, I don't know about you, is organizations saying, it used to be that we'd get calls and say, okay, we want you to audit the plan. We still get those audit the plan calls, but it's with a twist. It's, we want you to put us through a simulation so that we can audit our plan.
Yeah, fantastic.
Yeah, so there's a trend now going on with that. Technology helps with that.
Yes, I agree. Technology does help. And we can't really run away from it. I mean, we're using technology now, and look how simple it is to communicate to thousands and thousands of people with a unified message using technology. But if we tried to do this with, a can and string, maybe not so easy, right?
Yeah, no kidding. Absolutely. So looking at, evacuation plans and reentry plans, in my world of crisis communication planning and practice, crisis management, in that sense, evacuation plans and reentry plans aren't at the top of the priority list, even when sometimes they need to be at the top. So let's identify your two, or let's talk about your two different audiences or client bases, and let's kind of work our way through what that looks like for them, or what it should look like for them. What are some things that they should start to, if they don't already have this incorporated into their plan, what are some implementable things that they should start to just mull around in their mind and then bring to the table at the next, executive meeting?
That's a good point. I like the mull around in the mind. I would say that while there are things that they probably should mull around, the one thing they need to tattoo on their forehead is so that everyone can see it, including themselves in the mirror. And that is, do not try to recover from a disaster from within a disaster. If I got hit by lightning right now and couldn't say anything else to anyone else about responding to a disaster, that would probably be number one. To the private sector, there's so many people out there that seem to be putting most of their efforts into sheltering in place. There is clearly a lot of reasons why that should and could happen. But when you have a lot of damage to the infrastructure, there is it only gets worse and worse and worse and worse when you're asking people to show up in an area that is austere and that has damage and that won't support them or their activities. So that, in my view, Melissa, probably applies to 90% of all the listeners that you have out there today. The other 10% are going to be those critical infrastructure organizations, which would include the organizations that have to respond to disasters, the emergency responders, the public works, the force protection, the humanitarian aid, those groups. Those are the ones that should be going into a disaster while everyone else is leaving the disaster. So that's probably first and foremost, long before evacuation, long before reentry, is making the decision culturally that your plan should find a way to exist elsewhere unless you're in that small percentage of critical infrastructure.
That's a very important point. Very important. And the plans, evacuation plans, for example, say it's an organization that plans for the types of organizational crises that would apply to them, and say that emergency management isn't, they don't have a plant that's at risk of explosion, 24/7, depending on accidents that can happen.
Sure.
It's still important, and correct me if I'm wrong, to have that evacuation plan natural disasters or for, acts of God, crises that they don't necessarily predict or foresee or think about because they're not their faults, or, it doesn't impact the reputation of the organization, but it's still a crisis were it to happen to their
Right.
internal staff.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Melissa. Clearly my filter is more on the catastrophic end of things, but there's plenty of instances where you can have something big, bad, and ugly that is more virtual in nature, as you said, reputation related, organizational related, supply chain related, even where you're sitting in an office when your power's still on. My filter and therefore my comments were more for that catastrophic end of things, where you actually have physical, infrastructural damage, medical problems, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully I made that.
Oh, you did make it clear. I wanted to kind of state it or re-ask around it, because I think that it's an element that organizations, they're so focused on being able, well, the ones that are out there doing it right, they're so focused on being able to manage an organizational crisis, which was my point. So I apologize if I didn't communicate that properly, but they may not think about in my experience, they don't really think about, well, okay, what if a tornado ran through our building, and that's a different type of crisis that we're not planning for.
It's another great point, Melissa. The basis of all of that really starts with a threat and risk assessment. What are we afraid of? What are we likely to be? Not really what we're afraid of, because oftentimes we're afraid of things that we shouldn't be afraid of. But it's more, statistically, what are we likely going to be responding to? And a lot of times we think of something that is really catastrophic, when in the reality is that it's a truck that drives into the front of the building because you're at a dangerous intersection. That tends to be a bigger problem. So whatever that evil that lurks in the night is for your listeners, that really is where the starting point, not the ending point. If you live at the top of a mountain, then you probably are not going to be focusing a lot on flood response. If you live next to the coast, you're probably not going to be worried about landslides, or avalanches anyway. So once those are identified, then that really is the framework to decide, okay, now we have an idea of what could happen. How are we going to respond to it? And my advice is to look at it in the broadest sense. And I think you referenced that a little bit. We refer to it more as an all hazards. So that basically means anything that can go wrong, we want to have some sort of plan for it. If you recall, a couple of years ago, you remember the travel delays that were occurring because the volcano in Iceland, I think, was spewing off a bunch of volcanic ash, and it disrupted flights all over Europe. Mm-hmm. And people were losing their mind over that because they thought, well, we don't have a plan for this. And at the time, I had one client. Now I've got two that would fall into that category. And my response was simple. And I think they were a little annoyed that I didn't have more to offer. It was simply, this is not a volcano interruption plan that you're missing. It is a travel disruption plan that you're missing. And once you have a travel disruption plan, it really doesn't matter why it's disrupted. You just need to figure out the mechanisms and the buttons to push in order to reroute your travel or shelter in place or whatever the case is. And ultimately, I think they were at ease about that. But initially, people get caught up in the specifics when, in fact, if you approach it on a more broad or all hazards level, I think you can go to that next step a little bit easier. And that next step, of course, are your very clear and well-communicated objectives. Well, what do we want to see happen? And if you're selling widgets on the street corner and it's an extra job, well, maybe you just shutter your business until everything is restored, because you're not losing income, you're not putting people out of place, you're not providing a critical service. But on the other end of the spectrum, you might have a lot of people that are displaced, and you have to write objectives that address those critical needs, dealing with life safety and then property preservation and so on and so forth.
I love that point, because I'll often will get a new client that, maybe it's a startup or a smaller business that hasn't really thought of their crisis plan, and they'll sit there and they'll say, okay, well, we need a plan for every single type of crisis that it could strike us. And I love, that's an excellent example that you just gave with the travel and the volcano eruption, because it's what organizations need to do. They need to identify different types of risks, yes, but then take a step back and understand how to categorize them so that the plan is efficient, effective, and it's not 300 pages long.
Right. Yeah, excellent point. Well, if it's 300 pages long, at least for their flood response, they can stand on top of it and they won't get their feet. Right?
Yeah, one of them could, unless it's on an app.
Right, that's true.
Then they're just
the
lacking
apps
storage.
are everywhere, aren't they?
Oh yes. I'm a firm believer in leveraging mobile technology for crisis planning and for crisis management and for crisis communication, internal and external. So that's always interesting when you sit down with a new client and they say, okay, so we hear you talk about that often, but really, what does that mean? And you start kind of identifying different ways that mobile technology can come into play depending on the organization, and identifying very, very strategic opportunities that can be leveraged from, again, using today's technology.
Right. One of the public sector classes that I teach has to do with technical search and rescue. So it's using the technical devices, search devices, primarily those that fall in the visual category and those that fall in the auditory categories, listening sensors, seismic sensors, different types of cameras and that sort of thing to see within rubble and infrared and that sort of thing. And one of the first things we talk about is how they all break. And it's a bit of a shock to some of the students because they think, wait a second, we're here to build capability. We're not here to break it down. But once I get them to understand how they break, then a couple of key foundation pieces are put into place. One is they know how to keep it in service longer. And then probably the most important thing is when or if that it does break. And one of the common failure points is power supply issues. Again, filtering it by that most catastrophic of incidents where you don't have power supply in the area. The person that is reliant or overly reliant on those technical search devices to be a good searcher becomes less of a searcher when that camera is no longer available. So I found that when we build good searchers, regardless of what tool is in their hand, they are more valuable to the organization than someone that requires the use of a particular tool. So I use that as in my approach, and I don't get a lot of the questions in my private sector work on the mobile technology, but it does come up, and it comes up in forums like this where we talk about the cool things, and I mean really cool stuff that mobile technology is available in social media and the apps and all that kind of stuff. And sometimes I'm a bit on the geek side where I just can't get enough of them, playing with them and whatnot. But when you've got that catastrophic event, it is the person that can still embrace the lowest form of technology to get the job done, to me, adds the most value. So pen and paper, typically, and in a catastrophic event, is the lowest form of technology. Can I write you a note in such a way that it makes sense to you without me being there to explain it as to what happened here, so you don't have to go back into the same building and risk yourself? Or can I write using some symbology to indicate what area has been searched and what area has not been searched, so that you know where to put your energies next to improve life safety? Those sorts of things, through my filter, make the better searcher. And so it's that balancing act of, hey, let's figure out which apps are going to do us the best work right now, but let's never forget what happens when that app is no longer available. And I find that balancing act used to be easier. Now it's a little bit harder because there's so many ways that people are connecting it electronically.
We're dependent. We're starting to be dependent on technology. And you raise a really, really, really great point. And it brings me back that I just spent the weekend on a sailboat getting my sailing license. And there's so much cool technology for if you're in the middle of the ocean. And, I know all the terms in French, unfortunately, so I don't know what they are in English, but to understand the depth of the water below you, to understand, geo-targeting and all of that. So crisis aside, even it's just, anyways, it's in my mind right now going, we had to learn how to pinpoint where we are on a map without using technology. It's so important to learn that so that we don't completely depend on the technology that's available to us. And I think that a lot of, in your line of business, that to me would be extremely critical for your clients and for search and rescue individuals to understand. And on the simpler side of things, on my line of business, it's also important. I mean, and to your point, you can have your crisis plan on an app that's completely mobile and accessible, or not on an app, but actually on your phone. Well, through an app, but on your phone, completely accessible, completely mobile, completely useful and effective and efficient. And then, you drop your phone in the midst of a crisis and it smashes. What are you
Right.
going to do? So it's
Right.
very important to have a fail safe for your plan.
One of the we talked about exercising and kind of the connective link between what we were just talking about, Melissa, is when I asked the question to a lot of the groups, especially IT, a lot of people think of disaster response because in the business continuity world, disaster recovery really is just talking about the electronic framework. They're not really talking about the people or the facilities. So I have kind of just a sliver that I slide in there and try to bust it all open to say, no, if we're trying to get to the other side, it's really not the computers that we need as much as we need the people in the facilities. We need to get all this stuff to the far side of a disaster. But one of the questions that I ask is about their redundant power supply, because again, we are so reliant on technology, and technology is very reliant on power supply. So a lot of times, and this is true even in some of my public, and I've embarrassed a guy, unfortunately, unknowingly, because they had and this is a lot of companies have redundant power supplies, for example, large generators outside. Well, those generators sit there when it's bright and sunny outside, and they cycle them. If they're smart, they will cycle them regularly, maybe once a month for 15 minutes or so. And they will rely on the specifications for that generator to operate key services. So generator plus key services equals X amount of time in service. And so the specs will say that generator will run a certain number of systems for, let's say, 24 hours. Now, we remember in Hurricane Sandy, the hospitals there had this problem. They had generators that were supposed to last 5 days. They lasted 3 days. They had a lot of people that were on ventilators and whatnot that they had to rapidly evacuate to a better place. It was a big mishigas, so to speak. But what ends up happening is that in the real world, outside of not even just an exercise, is what else are people loading that system with? They're saying, well, it's not just the server that we need to power. Hey, I have my cell phone I need to power. Well, guess what? If I have my cell phone to power, you know what you need? You need your cell phone power too. So before long, people are loading up their localized grid with devices that are sucking more power than the specifications intended. And then you have, instead of these 5-day times in service, you have 3 days times in service. And when I bring that up to say, well, what is the load factor? Not the least of which is, what is your refueling plan? So when a generator does run out of power, how are you going to get fuel? Because if you go to a local gas station, that local gas station requires power to run their pumps, and they may be closed. So that usually gets their attention because they realize, wait a second, it's not just having a backup power is going to solve this problem. We need to have the whole infrastructure and mindset, and ultimately, like you started this conversation with, training to know when to push and when to pull.
It's so important, and that's the importance of working with a professional who does this day in and day out, right? For me, that's right there. I see the value, because organizations don't specialize in the way that you do. For example, they don't see what you see. They haven't made the mistakes that you've seen be made so that you are able to learn from them and continue to progress. That's the value right there in working with a professional who can really guide you and get you on the right track and open your mind to the different elements that your mind absolutely needs to be open to prior to experiencing the crisis.
That sounds like a great sales pitch for us, Melissa. Find people that make the most mistakes and then hire us.
Yeah, because they have the most life experience and they bring the most to the table.
Yeah, life experience. That's good. Yeah, my resume is 2 pages. My list of mistakes is 10 pages. But I would rather you look at my list of mistakes because I don't make as many of them twice. So.
It's interesting, and most people don't see it that way. But it's I see that often, and I say this anecdote often. Because it's the example that I use that comes to mind. But, when I'm sitting in a room with somebody within an organization, no matter what their role is, perhaps their role is the legal department, they're the legal department, and they'll start asking me questions and realizing things that, maybe the organization is a nonprofit that caters to children, and they're on Facebook and they're on Instagram because everybody is and parents are. and they start saying, oh my goodness, why do we not have a consent form for parents? Because we're taking pictures of their children and we're posting them online. And it's walking through this with me or with my team or with somebody like me, that they kind of realize the risks involved, and then they start to reflect on themselves and start saying things like, well, why didn't I think of that? This is my job to think of it. The answer is that no, it's not necessarily your job to think of it. Your job is to manage the legal risk of the entire organization. You're not going to think of every key component or every risk that social media newly brings to the table, or that mobile technology newly brings to the table, or that, whatever it may be, which is the whole point is why you're having this discussion with me right now.
Well, it goes back to that functional-based planning, as opposed to Johnny in legal thinking that he's got to be all things to all people. It's understanding, we identify the function and then delegate the task. And then once that's done, then Johnny can take a break.
Absolutely. Mike, you say something often, I've heard you say it, and you say that what's most important, now you're going to say it better than I am, so I'm paraphrasing, are you laughing? Okay. Doing the most good for the most people.
It is central to my life, Melissa, and I appreciate you bringing that up. As the better job I do remembering that, the better job I do for myself, for my family, for my community, for my clients, for everything in between. So it's not the most all-inclusive thing to say, because there are some losers when you say that, but the winners far outnumber the losers in that case. And
walk us through that.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Just walk us through that.
Well, it's situationally dependent, of course, on how you would apply that one guiding light or precept or whatever. But it's again, I'll go back to what I think most people want to hear from me, which is how to respond better to a catastrophic incident and to an unplanned event. And a lot of times we deal with lots and lots of choices, and those choices are: do we help the 20 people that are trapped in the house to the right, or do we help the 10 people that are trapped in the house to the left? And if it were easy to make that choice, then there would be 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 of me all over the internet sharing advice. But there's not a lot of people that can make those choices effectively. So, my hope is with my message is to try to get people to understand that we must make a choice and not get stuck on trying to help everything, to do all things for all people, because it's not usually possible. So doing the most good for the most people helps us with our objectives to stay focused on what's going to do the most good. An example of that would be on maybe a little less personal level, when we talked about the IT department. Okay, the IT department, they have their filter too, right? Save the server. How are we going to keep this server in business? But if they spend all of their time saving a server, and the Joey, who is the guy in accounting that's in a wheelchair on the 5th floor, he can't get out of the burning building and he dies, then what have we really done by saving that server? So doing the most good for the most people is identifying that people's lives are a lot more important than buildings and stuff. Preservation of property is subordinate to people. And then lastly is the restoration of the incident. If you just have to run for the hills in order to save everyone's lives, and you leave your 300-page plan behind, and if everyone is safe, then everything else becomes somewhat of a detail, because you now have accountability for everybody. But if you save the 300-page book and you kill someone in the process, then I would argue that we're not really doing the most good for the most people.
I love that. It's a great way and you communicate that, I'm sure, in all that you do with your clients, to kind of drill that into their own minds.
I certainly try. At a tactical level, when a guy's or gal is looking inside of a void space for a trapped victim, okay, I give them a very short time period in which to make a decision. Do we stay here and keep searching, or do we move on? And if we find somebody and they're unresponsive and they have injuries that are incompatible with life, do we stay here and try to piece them back together, or do we move on to try to the next person to try to find someone that can be saved? And a lot of times we as humans, most of my work obviously is done in North America, we as humans, we tend to help those that are in immediate need. And that's good to do unless that one person is being, while we're helping that one person, 10 other people that are 2 blocks away are not being helped, and they end up suffering as a result.
What a heart-wrenching, reality to
You know,
have to live
Katrina
through.
was probably, I sat in classes and I taught classes and we shared those precepts, but it wasn't really until probably Hurricane Katrina, that we were tested with that every single day after day after day after day, and it either would chew you up or you had to find a way to deal with it. And one of the ways that I've learned to deal with it is identifying that one personal requirement, that one touchstone. That, hey, if we're doing the most good for the most people, then we can deal with that loss of the ones that we're not able to help just a little bit better.
No, it's a tough job. I can't. We. It's funny because we both deal with crisis, and we have such different job descriptions and different experience.
But we all. But our clients look exactly the same on the backside of it, and that is: are you standing in a room with your favorite people, breathing calmly, knowing that you survived X?
Good point.
That's the objective. Then we've made it to the finish line. And we may be bloodied or bruised, but we're all standing there together saying, hey, we survived and we thrived.
Absolutely.
To me, that's mission accomplished.
Good point. So when we talk about the importance of clearly communicated and achievable goals, this is an issue that I think that we both see far too often within plans. Besides from testing the plan, in your experience, because testing the plan, in my opinion, is the best way to gain experience, to improve, to do all of that really, really great stuff that you need to be the best that you can be in the time of crisis. Before that step, when you're looking at, you're not working with a professional to develop the plan. Maybe you decide to call in the professional to test the plan. What are some good ways to, underline or to make sure that you're achieving, clearly communicated and achievable objectives rather than what looks good on paper and what is non-functional in reality?
That is the $1 million question, Melissa, and I appreciate you saying it the way you did. When we first met, one of the things that attracted us to each other professionally was the similarity in our filters for identifying who we will choose to work with. And I didn't obviously used to have this filter. I would take whoever hadn't had $1. But I've gotten more successful and I've gotten a little better at that filter. So here's my answer to your question, and I'll make sense of this in a moment. It starts at the gut level, the institutional level, that says, this is who we want to be. And those are the clients that you and I work with that says, we actually want to be better. We're not about lip service. We're not about pushing paper from one side of our desk to the other. We actually want to be better. If you're listening to this, call Melissa or call me, because you are our kind of person. If you're not that kind of person, listen and enjoy and pass it to someone who is, because it really is. There is a very clear line of who really is capable of doing the most good for the most people. So to me, that's where it starts. And when it starts at the top or the bottom, or whomever is framing their institution's desire and willpower to get through a disaster, through a crisis, then they create that culture. And that culture then becomes, and I'm using that word carefully but specifically, because then it becomes central to everything they do. If your objective is that we will survive a disaster by putting our people first and our facilities and our infrastructure second or whatever, then every meeting starts that way. Every meeting ends that way. All of the functional roles are framed that way. All the tactical decisions and operational decisions are crafted that way, all built around the overarching objective to survive and thrive on the backside of a disruption. So to me, it's not just writing it and putting it on the wall like a mission statement. It is believing it. It is writing it. It is believing it even more, and it is communicating it in every form and fashion possible to everyone possible, as often as possible.
I love that answer, because you're exactly on point. When you see that, now it doesn't have to be an emergency situation. It can be an organizational crisis. When you put your people and when you put your stakeholders and your audience groups first, and you communicate as a human to other humans with compassion and empathy, you're going to survive. You're going to survive, and you're probably going to survive with flying colors. So I love that that's the answer to my question.
I'm glad I could help.
Or I love that, yeah, that's your answer to my question, because not everybody. Oh, hello?
I'm still here.
Oh, okay, perfect. Sorry, I thought you faded out.
I was just adding some sound effects. Sorry.
Oh, there you go. There you go. Well, what are, I think that we kind of had this really great discussion. What are some key takeaways that you would want listeners to leave? I think that they've gained a lot. Hopefully, I think that they have. Hopefully, they feel like they have by listening over the last, 3/4 of an hour. What are some key takeaways? Last minute thoughts, or just, I guess, the most important things that you want them to leave with that they can actually go and turn into actionable steps internally.
Very good. Here would be my desire for those folks that are listening now or in the future. Look at your first, identify if you have the guts, and I don't mean that confrontationally. Do you have the institutional fortitude to do what it takes to get to the far side of a disruption? And most people do. They just have to commit to it individually. Once that's done, step 2 is identify what keeps you up at night. What are your hazards that you need to be planning to respond to, whatever those may be, whether it be reputational, virtual, all the way down to functional, operational, or structural even. And identify the functional roles that need to lend to a solution for that. And I said functional, not person specific, but functional roles. And then craft the clearly communicated objectives as to what specific things do we want to see happen by the time we're done with our response, whatever that response involves. And then lastly, carry with you a card on your lanyard, your bumper sticker, tattoo on your forehead, that if you believe in doing the most good for the most people, no matter what happens, no matter how big, bad, and ugly it is, you will get to the far side of this and be able to sleep well at night, knowing that you've done the best you can.
I love it. Excellent. Mike, where can everybody find and follow you?
You can find me virtually anywhere on the interwebs by searching Mike McKenna Team Solutions. You can find me at team-solutions.us. So team-solutions.us is the hub of my internet activity, but you can find me by searching pretty much anywhere on the internet.
Excellent. As well as at the bottom of this podcast, no matter where you're listening from, iTunes, Stitcher, or the Crisis Intelligence blog over at agnesday.com. Mike, it's always such a pleasure and so inspiring to chat with you. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Thanks for having me, Melissa. Appreciate it.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to this week's episode of the Crisis Intelligence Podcast. Stay tuned next Sunday when I speak with Tegan Ford, who is a new graduate and new professional in the field of crisis communications and PR. And she's going to talk to us about what it was like to be a graduate student, and then after that, what it was like to enter into the field, and differences, things that she would have loved to have learned in school that she could have taken with her to her new job, and all kinds of other fun stuff. We appreciate all of your support, and if you could share this podcast and go on iTunes and write us a review, give us your thoughts and your feedback, as well as any questions and suggestions for topics on crisis communications that you'd like to hear about, we definitely want to hear from you. Also, if you have any questions from Mike McKenna from this week's podcast, definitely send them my way via email or however you want to send them. I'll make sure they get to Mike, and I will publish the responses from Mike over on the Crisis Intelligence blog at agnesday.com. Thanks so much for tuning in this week, and I look forward to talking even more crisis intelligence with you next Sunday.